I came to the concept of drawing people together to talk about death and dying, explicitly writing advanced directives in a community group after, well, two things. One was that I had been volunteering as a hospice companion, and someone that I was working with didn't have directives, and an emergency came up when I was with her. And everything worked out, but during that interim period of a few hours, I wasn't sure how to appropriately care for her because I didn't know what her wishes were, and she didn't have them in writing. And so I came home and talked to my husband, Joe, about how important it was that we write our directives because I didn't ever want to put someone through that really tense situation of having to make a decision for someone else and then potentially regretting the choices that I might have made. I didn't want that for my family. Joe and I gathered resources and went to a brew pub on a Sunday afternoon thinking we could knock those things out in an afternoon because we were motivated and we were, you know, smart people and we trusted each other's judgment. And we sat down and couldn't get past the third question because we just didn't have enough experience to say, well, this is what I want under those circumstances. After muddling around a few more weeks, I just decided that our biggest problem was that we didn't have enough experience. We had lots of resources, but we didn't have experience to draw from because so many of us are separated from death and dying. And that's part of our culture these days, where it's medicalized and institutionalized and taken away from the family home so much different than it would have been 100 years ago. So I pulled together four other couples, and the 10 of us then, over the course of a few months, met several times and shared TED Talks and articles and books and podcasts and had really deep discussions about death and dying and what we would want. And the most important thing that we found through that process was sharing our experiences because collectively among 10 of us, we had a lot of experience with death and dying. We just didn't have it individually. So if we could share what that looked like with each other, we had a better framework from which to make decisions for ourselves. And so we completed that work in January of 16. And I was really excited because I thought, boy, we are so ahead of the curve. Joe and I were in our 50s. We were healthy. We certainly had 20 years before we'd have to pull out those documents again. And then in the fall of 17, Joe came home with a diagnosis of an advanced and very aggressive cancer. And he died 10 weeks later. And it was the blessing of having done this work together that allowed him to have a death that he was comfortable with, that was in alignment with his values, and allowed our family to come together and support him. We weren't divided about what we should do because we'd already had all those conversations as a family. And then the added benefit that I hadn't anticipated was that we had a community of friends who were all so comfortable about with talking about death and dying. Everybody has good friends, but not everybody's able to step into that space. And because we had created that group together, our immediate family had a secondary circle of support that came in and out of our house just very fluidly and supported us as we supported Joe in his death, in his dying. It was that experience that gave me a motivation and a sense of mission about sharing this model with people.
My husband, Jeff, was part of her first pilot group back, I think, in 2019. I didn't go through that, but I know Jeff was very busy at working at his advanced directives and talking with me and talking with our daughters and getting things filed down. And I honestly don't recall why I didn't do it at the same time, but I think it was doing some other stuff. And then we have the pandemic. And I was taking a class on death and dying, and I had a chance to visit with some folks who were facing that time and watch and learn what caregivers bring to the deathbed. I wonder if for us as Unitarian Universalists, it's a little bit more complicated because we don't have a shared creed, we don't have a shared scripture, and so this got me thinking about, well, how do we face death? What would it mean for us to be as a faith community, accompanying one another to and through death? I was talking with some members of our caring listeners team, and we recognized that we needed an entry conversation, some beginning vocabulary. And none of us had done the work that Terry is talking about. So we were really grateful that Terry agreed to offer thoughtful endings again and share one another's, what I think of as death stories. What have we lived through? What have we experienced? Who have we been with, sat with? Who have we lost? To hear our collective wisdom.
Michael and I, we had filled out our advanced directives in Living Will. Just not, you just fill it out because you think, oh, this is easy, one page. And going back through this class we've been in and really evaluating each thing I checked, it was like some of the things I had filled out earlier, I didn't feel the same about. Some of the little things like, I don't want the TV on if I'm dying, I don't want to hear Frank Azar. It was things taking more control of the little things of just having the TV off, or I want my teeth brushed. We got to be more specific on our death wishes.
Terry had invited me, and as much I admired Terry so much, I considered it, but I kept thinking in my own head, but I've got my durable power of attorney, so I'm done, right? I don't need to do anymore. And then Terry shared her full story. And shortly after that, a friend lost his partner, and they had had no conversation, no preparation. They had a durable power of attorney, medical power of attorney, but they hadn't talked about other things, and it was a nightmare for them. And so I thought, we don't want that to happen. I don't want that to happen in my relationship with Brian. And so Brian and I both signed up for the class because we knew that it's more than that piece of paper.
In 2003, our son died unexpectedly in a car crash. And at that time, we had never talked about death or what you want. But as an 18-year-old, he had signed his driver's license with a heart on it to be an organ donor and never told us. So at that night, I just asked, is there anything we can donate? And it started the process. And he was a tissue and a cornea donor. And I just think that would have been a missed opportunity, that we have to talk about these things with our children. And our children have certain wishes that we have to follow through on.
Joyce Unreal. No, I guess we've been through this process with both our parents, my son, very close friends, and you kind of see what goes on, the clumsy part and this and that. And it would be nice that when I pass, it's smooth for me, which it always is, or gonna be, but at the same time, it be smooth for everybody else on the planet too. It's more for other people than just us.
I think that one of the things I got from the group is that we have control. I mean, we may not be fully there when we die, but we can plan that now. We can be in control now of what that's going to look like. And we can save our families, our survivors, the stress of not knowing what we would really want. And having gone through that with both my mother and my father, there was no manual out there. I was feeling very lost trying to help them in their lives. And I can do that now for myself. I can save my son that anxiety and that worry. He can know exactly how I want the end of my life to happen. And I hope it takes a burden off him. And being slight control freak, I like the idea of being able to choreograph how I'm going. I'm living a full life. I want to end that life fully, my own terms.
Jade, I was just thinking as you said that I was recalling my conversation with the doulas and the ways that they would talk with each person about their birth plan, and that it's a way that everyone feels like they have some say. And then about 99% of the births don't go the way that you planned. But the idea of having the plan so that way as a baseline, that in and of itself makes it okay that it doesn't go according to plan. I think there's always a parallel in the process of birth and the process of death, that there's a lot of really similar, both practical and emotional things that happen in those processes. So yes, to control, and also in some ways having a sense of control is the most important, whether it actually goes according to plan.
You're absolutely right. We can plan for so much, and where we end up can be such a different place. But what we do know is we've got one shot to make it the best we can. There aren't any do-overs. So we can give it our best shot for our own well-being as we're dying. And beyond that, what we can do for sure is make it easier for the people who survive us. And I think when I'm at the end of my life, I know that I've cared for the people that matter most to me because they're not guessing about what I want. We've made amends. They know that I love them, that, those important things. We have no unfinished business. Then my death will be easier no matter how that happens. And I think dying is part of our legacy. It's the last story about us that gets told. And I'm hoping that I can model a death that I could be proud of, regardless of how that comes down. We're all so interconnected. Death doesn't just happen to the person who's dying. It's a trauma for everyone who cares for them. And it's an everyday trauma. It's a predictable trauma. So it makes sense to do what we can to mitigate that on the front side. And that's a big part of why I think this is important work.
Well, and I have a strong sense of denial that has served me well. It's kind of a soul booster. But, the cliche is nobody gets out alive. And so why, knowing that, do we continually not pay attention to one of the most important events in our life?
Absolutely.
I'm reading a book by Forrest Church. It's called Love and Death, My Walk Through the Valley of the Shadow. And he has, the chapter I'm in right now, it's talking about the Titanic. And he says, we are all on the Titanic. And if we dodge the iceberg or we get a lifeboat, there's another iceberg ahead. So, so that's one of the ways I'm thinking about death. Okay, here we are on the Titanic, which can sound really maudlin and fatalistic, but it's true. One of the exercises Teri has given us is a poem by Mary Oliver. and the metaphor Mary Oliver uses is death comes like a hungry bear, and death purchases it with its coins and snaps its purse shut. And that's not how I'm thinking about death, but I'm thinking about death like the inevitable march of time, like the horizon is whether I like it or not is rising, and the sun is going to set. So that's what I'm working with. And what do I do while there's light? What do I do with this time? And I find myself thinking about my date with death and how I want to be hospitable. What would it mean to meet death in a hospitable way? And part of it is this planning that we're talking about to talk with our family members, how physically we want to meet death, how the stage might be set, what the words are, what's the musical track playing in the background. And I don't know whether it's possible to do this. One of the things that surprised me in the material that Teri shared with us is the different choices that people who work in this industry, the different choices that doctors make about their deaths. Many of them saying no to those things that we would think would be part and parcel of care with a terminal diagnosis. Many of them saying no to surgery, no to chemotherapy, no to radiation, no even to dialysis or antibiotics even. And yet, I'm also reading some work by a UU minister, Nancy Schaefer, who wrote a book of poetry during the time between which she was diagnosed with a terminal illness and her death. And she talks about how it may be easier to have gone quickly, but it would not be as rich. So that's where I'm stuck. How do I meet death? With the slam of a door in its face, or lancing out the door, or kind of, cracking the door open and having death come in. I don't know.
I was thinking of the lesson that we're told as ministers, that the most important act of ministry is how you leave. Everything else you do in your entire tenure, it is less important than how well you leave. And just what you said really reminded me, this idea that it's the last story, that it can have like such a lasting impact, how that goes for all the things we do in our life that we spend often so much intention and care thinking about, that this thing that could have such a major impact on the world after we're gone, that we spend so little time thinking about it, because we don't, as you said, it sounds dreadful or whatever, but actually it is the biggest gift that we could offer the people that we love, and to the world, to really think about that with intentions. I love the idea of it being the last story of our lives. How we die is part of that legacy.
I think about the messages for the end, and it's not as though this can be scripted, but it's been really helpful to spend some time on material around the kind of the final words, the final things that need to be wrapped up in the end. And there's five of them. There's I'm sorry, I forgive you, thank you, I love you, and then goodbye. How each of us is going to say that to those we leave behind is going to be very personal. But one of the reminders from this time is that we don't have to wait for the end to say to say those things. Well, maybe with the exception of goodbye, but I'm sorry, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you can be said now, and we can keep saying that until we do go.
That's really beautiful, and it makes me think that a lot of the content of what you're discussing is about that end of life time, but ultimately has a big potential impact on how you're living before that. I'd love to hear if there's been things like that for each of you feel like has taught you about life by considering death in a more intentional way, what it has taught you about how you want to live.
I don't know if this fits in there, but I think there's so much stress on individuals, you know. I mean, I'm sure they're meant to be inspiring, but, you know, like that one guy who says when he went to the cemetery, you know, there's 1962 dot, you know,
Yes.
1975, and they say, make your dot count. And it's like, come on, man, give us a break. We're not all going to be in who's who. You know, it's like, can't we just live our lives like we want to, without anybody telling us how we're supposed to do? We're all supposed to be president. Well, there can only be one president at a time, you know, and I think it's a cultural thing. You know, we love winners, but at the same time, we can't all be winners, you know, and we're not losers just because we don't win. And that applies to death too. You know, it's like, I don't want to go to heaven. I'm sorry. There's people there that I don't want to spend eternity with, you know, and, and you know, give me an alternative.
Michael, you know what you made me think of is yesterday I was listening to the podcast Elaine and Sean did a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about the quote from Annie Dillard that we've been quoting a lot in this series about how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. And they were reflecting on how it can feel like a judgment or an indictment of, you're wasting your life kind of idea. And, where they came around to is a sense of just how important the mundane parts of life are. It reminds me of, there's a poem, I think it's Marie Howe, and it's called What the Living Do. And it's a list of just things like, put on the tea kettle, do the laundry. It's a reminder of, that when it comes to living, what it means to live, it actually is so filled with so many mundane, small things. And that is, we need to remember that that's worthy of cherishing, the most simple daily acts of care And I hear that in what you're saying is coming to terms with death is also about accepting a sense of the regularness of life and how beautiful just being regular can be. And that doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be that coming to terms with death doesn't have to be a pressure to somehow make every moment, carpe diem, that instead it actually can be about cherishing the life that you have.
I think the experience I had with both my parents, I learned more from their aging process than actually their death, because neither one of them liked aging, and they fought it, and they fought it really hard. And, spoiler alert, the golden years aren't so golden, but they're there and they're going to happen, and we all have to go through it. And I found that that's helped. It helped me to let go of some things that I think that are part that where I enjoyed when I was younger and I shouldn't enjoy when I'm older, but and embrace others. I mean, I don't walk in the winter when it's icy because I don't want to fall down and break my wrist. However, somebody gave me crampons that I can put on my shoes, and so I now can walk on the ice and not be fearful. But I want to live fully, but understand that as I age, it will be different, and that's okay, and to embrace that and find the goodness in it. I'm thinking about my mom, who had this practice of sitting outside every morning, regardless of the weather, or if she didn't actually sit out there, she would do what she described, poking her nose out the door and breathing and seeing what the weather was. I think of it as her spiritual practice. Poke her nose out the door, see what the weather is, breathe the air. That Amy Dillard thing, what's a real priority for me, what I need to do every day, I need to get outside. And if I were to die tomorrow or next week, I still want to get outside today. I still want to get outside and walk and see the sky and just practice that being. And maybe that's what mortality in the forefront helps me appreciate. It's not about the doing, but it's about getting out there and being.
I think one of the inhibitors to doing this work is contemplating our own death. But another piece that perhaps stays hidden is that in talking about our potential death, it brings up the deaths that we've experienced in the past. And I think there's a fear that opening those conversations are going to open those old wounds. I started doing hospice work back in 2012 after my mom died, and my dad died in 16, and my husband died in 17, and it felt so overwhelming and so painful. But what I found in doing these workshops and having these conversations with people over and over again is that there's healing that happens when we are able to share our stories, and that our perspectives change as we tell the stories a new time, and our stories change. What we need to tell and what we discover changes over time. And with that, the relationship that we've had with the person who has passed also changes. And that's my biggest surprise. I had a really difficult relationship with my mom in particular. And when she first died, that was really, really raw. And now over time, as I've told the story and I've learned more about aging and I've heard other people's experiences, my story about my mom has changed and my relationship with her has gotten so much better. And I didn't think that was possible when one person wasn't here, but it is.
I wonder if that resonates for others of you and what your experience has been like, just in terms of how these conversations have impacted your sense of losses in your life, or how if you resonate with Teri's sense of that shifting relationship.
I make a practice when I go to the cemetery. I look people up around. You can find their background because, everything's online, and I get a little history. We have cemetery plots, which people don't go to buy cemetery plots anymore. So that's sort of the lost of the death ritual. And we really struggled with, do we get a cemetery plot? And I call it my timeshare. And my friends right next to us, I said, we're going to be neighbors for eternity. Like, see, we have a sense of humor. And we have such a beautiful city cemetery and the wealth of knowledge there. And I've met the man who goes around and he's documenting the wildlife, and you get to talking to people. The cemetery is not a sad place, but I decided when things were really too much for me, I go sit there because there is no time in the cemetery. And it's just sort of a calm place. And when people say, "Oh, how can you do that?" It's just so sad. And it's like, no, it's history, and it's people's stories. And just reading headstones, you find out a story. I think we've gotten away from funerals. And, well, we even, Carrie and I and Michael were at a talk with Dr. Wolfelt, and he talked about the funeral. And, we want to call it a celebration. Why can't we just be sad and mourn and grieve and just be that person, that is missing somebody. And we tend to like, oh, they're great. They had a great life.
I have to disagree with Dr. Wolfield, and I've been to a lot of his talks, and he's a wonderful man. But when I would say, since I've been going to funerals lately, I'm excited to see people, and people see other people. It's kind of like a reunion, and Ellen said, you should grieve, you shouldn't be happy. And I always think, you got the rest of your life to grieve. But right now, here are some people you haven't seen in a long time. And I remember at my dad's service, my mom and all my sisters being mad at me, seriously mad at me, because I wasn't sad. And I was just excited to see people that I hadn't seen in years. And I didn't want to tell them, but I'll tell you, my son had died 6 months earlier. That was sad. My dad's death was not sad. I can tell you what sad is. And my dad's funeral, my mom's funeral, and everybody since then. It's not sad, you know, and everybody has something to measure against. I guess that's my measurement. And to me, sorry, Alan, I disagree.
It is true that it's one of those rituals. I've been to many where there's a sense of why don't we get together when it's not a funeral? It brings me to another question I've been wondering about. You've been doing this whole thing in the context of the pandemic. I just makes me wonder what it has felt like for you guys in particular to be doing this in the context of COVID.
And I've asked myself, why this, why now? And I'm not sure what the answer is. I think my daughters would tell me it's just developmentally appropriate more you are the age that you are. And my mom died almost a year and a half ago now. And we've had this pandemic going on. So all those things, all the people who have lost people could be the reason for thinking about death, especially as a faith community. I think it's good to ask ourselves, how are we doing with this mortality thing that is real and affects us? It's not just theoretical. Some of our community are living and living with this dying thing right now. So how do we be together with them? How do we see them in their loss and in their grief? One of the things that I heard at the grief workshop that Dr. Alan Wilford had done, that how we no longer wear black armbands. It used to be that was a mark of a loss, and we would see people, or we would wear our black armbands for a year, so that if we were off our game, if we were not focused, if we were distracted, if we were sad, well, people would know you've lost someone. Who have you lost? How are you doing? And we don't have that visual signal anymore. All the ways that we can talk about death and loss and grieving seems to me are worthy ways to explore how we can be good companions for one another for all of life.
As you were talking, it made me realize, maybe part of the reason that the COVID situation is people's unwillingness to take it seriously. That some of that comes back to our incapacity to talk about death. our sense of it being morbid or, how dreadful it must be that part of this, the conspiracy theory is born out of our profound just cultural practice of denial. We have so much muscle memory around denial that we can't, the cognitive dissonance of having to face more than 700,000 deaths in a year are just, we just can't. So we have to come up with another solution. Part of the spiritual practice in the midst of the pandemic is to actively be working against the denial. Just invite any additional insights about what is most essential in life or what is most essential in death.
I guess my word would be compassion. Compassion for everyone involved, even the people that are saying silly things. We have to have compassion for everybody around death because it's different for everybody.
The survivors are what it's all about. Jimi Hendrix once said, the dead, they ain't crying.
I'd come back to the things to say at the end, the things to live to the end, to reflect on where it needs to be said. I'm sorry. I forgive you. Thank you. And I love you.
I like to think about the idea that being able to talk about death and dying and planning for how we might want our lives to end is part of healthcare literacy. And it's a literacy that we aren't very well versed with in our culture, but it's really essential not only for our well-being, but for the people who love us. And that the easiest place to do this well is with friends and family and community. So I'm inviting everybody to start talking to their neighbors about death and dying.
Thank you all so much for this good conversation. Thank you all for your time and your wisdom and insights and just being willing to share some of what you've taken away. It's really valuable. So thank you.